The first time someone told me I should be afraid of an HOA president, I laughed. Honestly, I thought people were exaggerating. Because how much trouble could one overly enthusiastic volunteer really cause? Turns out, a whole lot, especially when that volunteer starts believing the neighborhood belongs to her instead of the people who actually own the property. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 35 years old, and I run a small landscape design business just outside Franklin, Tennessee. Most of my days are spent planting trees, rebuilding neglected gardens, and helping families turn empty yards into places they actually enjoy coming home to. I'm not loud, I don't enjoy arguments, and I've always believed paperwork solves more problems than yelling ever will. That belief was tested harder than I ever imagined the morning I watched a concrete truck slowly erase a property right my family had owned for nearly 40 years. It was barely 6 in the morning when my phone buzzed. My neighbor, Mr. Wallace, sounded strangely nervous. "Emily, you might want to get over here. They're pouring concrete behind your lot." I didn't even stop to finish my coffee. I threw on my boots, grabbed my truck keys, and drove the 3 minutes back toward my property, still convincing myself there had to be some misunderstanding. Maybe the contractor had the wrong address. Maybe someone mixed up survey stakes. Maybe this would all be cleared up in 5 minutes. Instead, I pulled around the corner and saw 3 pickup trucks, a concrete mixer, stacks of lumber, and half a dozen workers moving with the kind of confidence people have when they believe nobody can stop them. Standing in the middle of it all was Linda Prescott, president of the Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association, wearing spotless white sneakers that somehow stayed clean despite the mud, holding a travel mug with a tiny silver crown on top like it had been made specifically for someone who enjoyed reminding everyone she was in charge. She wasn't working. She wasn't measuring anything. She simply stood there smiling while pointing at different parts of the foundation, as if she were directing an orchestra. Then I noticed exactly where the forms had been placed, and my stomach dropped. They weren't just close to my recorded access easement, they were sitting directly on top of it. Every inch of concrete they poured would block the only legal vehicle access to the back parcel I'd spent the last 2 years preparing for development. That land wasn't some investment I'd planned to flip. It was where I hoped to build a small nursery for my business, something I'd saved for through hundreds of long weekends and thousands of hours working in other people's yards. I walked toward Linda, carrying the folder I kept in my truck, the one that held every survey, deed, and property map I'd ever needed. I wasn't angry yet. Confused, absolutely. Frustrated, sure, but I still believed reasonable people made reasonable decisions when they saw the facts. "Linda," I called calmly, waiting until she looked at me, "I think there's been a mistake. Your contractor is building across my easement. We need to stop before this gets any farther." She glanced at the papers in my hand, smiled without the slightest hint of concern, then slowly lifted her coffee mug for another sip before answering. "Emily, you worry too much." I opened the plat map and pointed directly at the recorded easement. "This isn't an opinion. It's recorded with the county. My access runs straight through where your foundation is going." She barely looked. Instead, she gave one little laugh that somehow managed to sound both amused and insulting at the same time. "Honey," she said, loud enough for every worker to hear, "I'm the president of this HOA. If there's a problem, you can file a complaint with me." A few of the contractors awkwardly looked away. One older foreman glanced toward the survey stakes, then toward me, almost like he realized something wasn't right but didn't want to challenge the woman signing his checks. I tried one more time. "I'm not asking for a favor. I'm asking you to pause until we verify the property lines." Linda tilted her head, flashed that same confident smile, and actually waved her hand toward the concrete truck. "Keep pouring," she called. "We're already behind schedule." The engine roared back to life. Gray concrete flowed into the forms while I stood there holding documents that suddenly felt invisible. Before turning away, Linda gave me a tiny little wave, almost playful, as though this entire conversation had been entertainment for her morning. That was the exact moment something changed inside me. I realized I wasn't dealing with someone who misunderstood the law. I was dealing with someone who believed power meant never having to care what the law said. I climbed back into my truck, closed the folder, took one long breath, and instead of calling the sheriff or arguing with construction workers, I drove straight toward the Williamson County Recorder's office because if Linda Prescott wanted to play a game built on paperwork, she had just picked a fight with the one person in the neighborhood who never threw away a single document. The recorder's office wasn't exactly where people went looking for justice. It was where people went looking for facts, and facts have a funny way of surviving long after egos burn themselves out. I knew that because my grandfather had drilled one lesson into me since I was a kid, helping him maintain fences on family property. Never argue with someone's opinion when you can quietly hand them a recorded document. 2 hours later, I was sitting across from a county records clerk named Martha, a woman who had probably forgotten more about land law than most attorneys ever learned. She disappeared into the archive room, returned carrying several oversized plat books and scanned copies of original filings, then spread everything across the counter. "Well, she muttered while adjusting her glasses. "That's interesting. Those are words nobody wants to hear when their property is involved." She traced her finger across an old survey recorded in 1986, then pulled another amendment from several years later. "Your access easement is perpetual," she explained. "It isn't temporary. It wasn't granted by the HOA, and it certainly can't be removed because somebody builds over it." Hearing someone else say those words felt like finally taking a full breath after holding it all morning. Before leaving, I ordered certified copies of every document connected to my parcel, every amendment, every survey, every utility agreement, and every recorded map that mentioned that 12-foot strip of land. If this turned into a legal fight, I wanted the original paperwork speaking louder than I ever could. On the drive home, I called my attorney, Daniel Mercer. Daniel wasn't flashy. He didn't advertise on billboards or make dramatic promises. He specialized almost exclusively in property disputes, which meant he had the patience of a farmer and the memory of an elephant. I met him that afternoon, spreading every document across the conference table. He studied them quietly for nearly 20 minutes before finally smiling. "Emily," he said, leaning back in his chair, "this may be one of the clearest easement violations I've seen in years." I expected him to talk about injunctions, demolition orders, emergency hearings. Instead, he asked a question I wasn't expecting. "Do you actually need that structure removed immediately?" I blinked. "Of course," he shrugged. "Eventually, yes, but maybe not first." He walked over to a bookshelf, pulled down a thick property law reference, flipped through several pages, and tapped one paragraph. "Permanent occupation of an easement creates damages, and depending on the circumstances, those damages can include fair market rental value for the occupied property interest." I stared at him. "You're saying—" "I'm saying," he interrupted with a grin, "if she insists on keeping part of your property rights under her sunroom, she can pay for the privilege every single month." Suddenly, this wasn't just about stopping construction anymore. Daniel hired 3 independent commercial appraisers over the next week. None of them knew each other. None of them worked together. Their reports came back remarkably close, placing the rental value of that occupied easement between $2,300 and $2,500 per month. Daniel chose the middle number, $2,400, fair, defensible, impossible to dismiss as exaggerated. Then came the move that changed everything. We recorded a formal lease interest and accompanying claim against Linda's property title, effective retroactively from the day the concrete cured, with interest continuing to accumulate until the encroachment disappeared. Nothing dramatic happened that afternoon. Nobody was arrested. No television crews showed up. That's the thing about paperwork. It works quietly until somebody tries to refinance a house. 48 hours later, Daniel's office phone rang. Linda's attorney introduced himself with enough confidence to fill the room. "This filing is ridiculous," he announced. "My client intends to challenge every bit of it." Daniel thanked him politely, then emailed over the complete package: certified surveys, historical plats, the independent appraisals, high-resolution drone photographs showing bright orange survey flags surrounding the new foundation like investigators marking evidence after a crime scene. 15 minutes passed. Then 30. The phone rang again. Same attorney, different voice, much quieter this time. "Would your client be willing to discuss settlement?" Daniel smiled without saying a word, covered the receiver, and whispered, "Confidence usually expires the moment facts arrive." Meanwhile, Linda was doing exactly what people like Linda always seem to do. Instead of admitting she'd made a mistake, she doubled down. She scheduled an emergency HOA board meeting and filled the agenda with language that sounded official enough to intimidate people who didn't understand property law. According to the meeting notice, the board would be considering revisions affecting community access rights and easement enforcement. Translation: she planned to convince everyone they could simply vote my easement out of existence. Neighbors started calling me. Some were worried. Others were embarrassed. One elderly couple apologized for not speaking up while construction was happening because they assumed Linda had permission. I told every one of them the same thing. Don't argue with her. Just attend the meeting if you want. Listen, the clubhouse was packed that Tuesday night. Folding chairs lined the walls. People stood in the back holding paper cups of coffee, whispering before the meeting even started. Linda entered like nothing had happened, smiling, greeting residents by name, carrying that same silver-crowned travel mug she'd become strangely famous for. She opened the meeting by describing me as an unreasonable landowner attempting to exploit a harmless home improvement project. Then she introduced a motion declaring the disputed easement unnecessary because, in her words, community needs have evolved. I almost laughed. Property rights don't evolve because an HOA president decides she'd rather have a larger sunroom. Before anyone could vote, the association's own attorney slowly raised his hand. His expression suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. Madam President, he began carefully, for the record, the board does not possess legal authority to extinguish or modify a recorded easement belonging to another property owner. Such rights are established by deed and county record, not association vote. The room became so quiet I could hear somebody stirring sugar into coffee across the room. Linda blinked twice. Are you saying we can't simply approve this? He answered without hesitation. Correct. Even a unanimous vote would have no legal effect. You could actually watch the confidence drain from her face. She tried changing the subject, tried criticizing my development plans, tried suggesting I wasn't being neighborly, but every argument kept running into the same immovable wall, the law. As residents filed out after the meeting, several people stopped to apologize. One contractor quietly admitted he'd questioned the survey from the very beginning, but was told to continue anyway because Linda insisted she had complete authority. That conversation turned out to matter more than any of us realized. A week later, the HOA treasurer called a closed executive session after reviewing association credit card statements. Hidden among ordinary maintenance expenses sat a $2,000 payment to a private title investigation company. Linda hadn't spent her own money trying to dig through my property history. She'd used HOA funds to investigate me personally, hoping to find leverage that would somehow erase decades of recorded ownership. Residents who had defended her suddenly felt betrayed. People can forgive arrogance. Misusing their money is another story. The following Tuesday, the board voted to remove Linda as president, pending a broader financial review. She walked out without saying goodbye, clutching that silver mug so tightly I honestly thought the handle might snap. I watched from the parking lot as she drove away, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I realized the concrete she poured across my easement wasn't going to be the biggest thing she'd lose before all of this was over. Over the next several weeks, I didn't hear much from Linda, and honestly, that silence worried me more than the arguments ever had. People who spend years believing they're the most powerful person in the room rarely disappear quietly. They usually come back with one last move, one last threat, one last attempt to prove they were right all along. But this time, the law moved faster than pride. Daniel called me one Friday morning with the kind of calm voice he always used when delivering very expensive news to someone else. Her lender found the recorded claim during the refinance process, he said. Closing is frozen. Apparently, Linda had planned to refinance her house to help pay for several renovation projects, including the beautiful new sunroom that had started this entire mess. Instead, the title company informed the bank that no clean transaction could move forward while a recorded property interest remained attached to the title. Every month, the amount continued growing. Every month, interest accumulated, and every month that structure stayed exactly where it was. The problem became more expensive. Her attorney reached out again, except this time there wasn't a trace of confidence left. There were no threats, no lectures, no promises about crushing us in court. Instead, he asked a very simple question. What will it take to resolve this? Daniel answered just as simply, honor the easement, satisfy the recorded obligation, and restore the property. About 2 weeks later, a wire transfer landed in the trust account. 18 months of negotiated lease payments, accumulated charges, legal costs, and filing expenses were finally settled so the claim could be released after full compliance. I wasn't celebrating because of the money. The money was never the point. What mattered was that someone who had spent months insisting rules only applied to other people had finally been forced to live under the same rules everyone else followed. Then came demolition weekend. I will never forget waking up Saturday morning to the sound of impact drivers instead of concrete mixers. The same neighborhood that I watched workers build the sunroom now watched a different crew carefully take it apart. one window at a time, one beam at a time, one section of roof after another. Nobody cheered. Nobody mocked her. People simply sat in lawn chairs, drinking coffee, quietly watching accountability happen in real time. There was something strangely peaceful about it. No screaming, no revenge. Just the slow reversal of a decision that should never have been made. I walked over after the last section had been removed. The orange survey stakes were visible again, stretching across the easement exactly where they had always belonged. For the first time in months, I could stand there without feeling my chest tighten. Mr. Wallace wandered over, hands in his pockets, smiling the way grandfathers smile when they already know the ending before everyone else. Funny thing about property lines, he chuckled. They don't care who gets elected. We both laughed because it was true. A few days later, I drove past Linda's house. The patio looked strangely empty. The silver travel mug she carried to every confrontation, every board meeting, every construction morning, it was gone. Maybe she'd thrown it away. Maybe it was packed in a cabinet somewhere. Maybe she simply couldn't stand looking at the reminder anymore. Either way, it disappeared at the same time her illusion of absolute authority did. Looking back now, I realized this story was never really about an easement, a sunroom, or even an HOA. It was about what happens when someone mistakes a position of leadership for ownership, when authority slowly becomes entitlement, and entitlement convinces a person they're too important to read the documents everyone else is expected to respect. I also learned something about myself. Years ago, I probably would have matched anger with anger. I might have shouted across the property line or let frustration push me into making a mistake. Instead, I discovered that patience isn't weakness. Silence isn't surrender. And the strongest response is often letting the facts do the talking while everyone else is busy raising their voice. Today, my nursery is finally under construction. Trucks use that access road every week. And every time I drive across that easement, I remember how close I came to losing something that had been legally protected all along. Not because the law failed, but because one person assumed nobody would challenge her. So now, I'd really like to hear what you think. If you were standing in my boots that morning, would you have stopped the concrete truck yourself? Or would you have handled it the same way and let the legal system do the work? And here's the bigger question. Should HOA leaders face harsher personal consequences when they knowingly abuse their authority? Or was this outcome already enough? Let me know your thoughts in the comments because stories like this always spark strong opinions. And if you've ever dealt with an HOA, a difficult neighbor, or someone who thought they were above the rules, share your experience below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications because the next story might be even harder to believe than this one.